Aloha, I'm Reece Jones. I'm a professor of geography and environment at the University of Hawaii and the author of 4 books, including Nobody is Protected and White Borders.
Well, thank you for joining us. And today we will be talking about white borders, the history of race and immigration in the United States from Chinese exclusion to the border wall. And I would like to begin with the question I ask everybody is, how did you get to this book and what did you hope to achieve or what did you learn in kind of putting it together?
Yeah. So I wrote my second book is Violent Borders, and that came out in October of 2016. So just before Donald Trump was elected president of the United States. And that book talks about why borders have become increasingly violent, why all these walls are going up at borders. And so it was really disconcerting to me to see Donald Trump using all of these themes that I had written about in his campaign for the presidency, and particularly describing them in such racialized terms. And so I decided that I needed to go back and look at the history of immigration laws in the United States to see if what Donald Trump was doing was something kind of new and unique, or whether it fit into the longer history of the way that immigration had been represented in the country over many years. And as I find in the book, it's a through line, right? There are these kind of really distinct connections between the first immigration laws in the United States and the way that Donald Trump was talking about these same sorts of issues.
Yeah, it's really striking with some of the quotes you pull out, just how similar it is. But I would like to begin with you say in the beginning of the book that the argument of the book is simple. Immigration laws are about racial exclusion in this country. And maybe you could explain, that's a provocative statement. And I think when you think about it, it makes sense. But if you would explain a little bit about what you intended by that statement.
Yeah, I think one question I often ask audiences when I'm talking about this book or really about immigration in the US more generally is, when did the United States first have rules about who could enter the country? And most people assume that those have always existed, right? From the start, that would be one of the first things that a country put in place. But that's not the case, right? In the United States, the first federal immigration rules, national rules about who could enter the country, are not put in place until the 1870s, right? So a century after the Declaration of Independence. So that means that for over 100 years, there was no need to determine who could enter the country. So then the question should be, well, why did they start to decide they do need rules about who can enter this country? And once you start to look at that, it's always about race. So the first immigration laws in the United States were the Chinese Exclusion laws that were put in place after people from China started to immigrate to the West Coast in the aftermath of the gold rush. And then, as I document in White Borders, as kind of each new group of non-white immigrants start to show up at the borders of the United States, new laws are put in place to restrict those entries. And so there is a direct connection between why these laws were established and the notion of protecting a version of a white country in the United States. And as I document in the book, they were not subtle about this. The speeches and arguments in the 1870s through the 1920s are explicitly about protecting a version of racial purity in the United States. So the way that Donald Trump talks about these things in more recent years is directly connected to the ways that they were framed in those previous periods.
Well, thank you for that. And I think we should begin with the first immigration law, which was the Chinese Exclusion Act, right, of, what is it, 1882? So would you tell us about that and how it came to be, just briefly? We don't have to get into the weeds about it, but because it's striking, because it's a very small percentage of the population that leads to this kind of overblown reaction, correct?
Yeah, you asked for a short explanation, but maybe I can talk a little bit longer because I think it's an important moment and it really ties together some of the histories to explain why that moment is when it happened. So as I mentioned, there weren't any federal immigration laws until 1875 is the first one, and then the Chinese Exclusion Act is in 1882. But there were rules about who could become a citizen of the United States. And the first Naturalization Act of 1790 limited that to free white person. That's the language that was in that law. And so it's quite clear that the founding of the United States envisioned the country to be a country for the white population of it, right? I mean, it was built on slavery and an exclusion of other people who were not white. The aftermath of the Civil War is a key moment then, right? Because after the Civil War, there's Black citizenship, there's birthright citizenship, and as I argue in the book, it's a period of, in the aftermath of that, in Reconstruction, of a reaction by the white elite population to this new reality, which they hadn't really anticipated, I think, on the whole. And in the book, I argue there are three kind of big reactions. The first is violence, right? We see the Ku Klux Klan, we see Jim Crow laws, we see kind of a reimposition by force of that previous white supremacy within the United States. A second reaction is removal. In the years after Black citizenship, there are a series of efforts that we would think of today as deportation, but of efforts to move freed slaves back to Africa, right? So the colonization movement, there's a group called the American Colonization Society that's behind that. It doesn't actually disband until 1964, by the way. But the third one is the one that I'm most interested in the book, is the reaction to the realization that there is Black citizenship in the United States. We see politician after politician in the 1870s saying we have to accept that reality, but no more, right? And so the emergence of these immigration laws are a direct response to that, right? Because as they start to see a relatively small number of people arriving on the west coast of the United States from China who don't fit in this white narrative of the country, there's a very quick reaction to that to prevent that immigration. So the Chinese Exclusion Law is the culmination of that effort to continue to protect this version of a white country and to prevent non-white immigration to the United States.
Well, yeah, thank you for that background on it, because I think it is important to the next kind of phase of, because one of the things that always comes up is immigrants are considered, how do I say this? Are immigrants considered white or non-white? And in the expansion of whiteness, there's also a contraction of whiteness. And there's this allocation, maybe is a better word. And some themes come out of the Chinese Immigration Act of otherization. And part of that is this immigrant fear, the fear of immigration that leads to great replacement theory, the suicide of the West, white genocide, all this kind of breeding type language. So if you could tell us how Chinese exclusion led into this white fear, white reallocation of whiteness.
Yeah, that's right. There have been a number of historians that have looked at the history of the term white, right? And it's there's no genetic basis to it, right? It's not a real category in that sense that it has an essence and is fixed. Instead, it's a human idea. It's a creation. It's something that humans have talked about and debated and socially constructed through language and through understandings. And so the period of the late 1800s, beginning of the 1900s in the United States was also a period of kind of consolidation around exactly who counted as white, right? Because that first naturalization law in 1790 said free white person, but it didn't define that, right? And so there was a lot of kind of moving back and forth about who actually does count. I think probably your listeners will know that in the 1850s, there was some hand-wringing in the United States about Irish immigration, right? Partially about the Catholic nature of that immigration, but also about whether people from Ireland were white, right? And there were debates about whether they counted or not during that period of time. And that continues in the aftermath of the Chinese exclusion, because as new groups start to arrive, new laws start to be put in place to put limits on that. We also see the courts dealing with this issue. And so there are a series of court cases starting in the 1880s, but it doesn't really reach the Supreme Court until the 1920s, where people will petition for citizenship in the United States to be naturalized as a citizen. And then the court has to decide, is someone from Armenia white? Is someone from Iran white? Is someone from Turkey white? Is someone from India white? And as I document in the book, there is these kind of conflicting decisions, right? And in one magistrate's court, someone from India is white because they have this Aryan heritage. Then in another, they're not, right? And so that finally reaches the Supreme Court in 1922 and 1923. And in these two cases, the court really narrows the definition, right? So what had been seen a little more broadly by some of the magistrates in lower courts, the Supreme Court says, no, what we mean when we say free white person is someone with white skin who is from Northern Europe, right? And anything outside of that doesn't count in this definition.
Yeah, and there's a great series of paragraphs in which you kind of break down the year and which ethnicity was considered white at that time, which it goes back and forth. So like in one, I love this sentence, which in 1910, 1913, 1919, 1920, South Asians were white. But, and then because you had to keep redefining it, right? It wasn't just because new cases would come up against someone being denied, right? And then they would fight it and get whatever the status. But could we talk more about kind of the movement because one of the things that I noticed in the book, and I know that you did this purposefully, is that some of the rhetoric that comes out of the Chinese anti-immigration, like the waves, yellow waves, and describing people in degenerate terms and women as all prostitutes, this kind of sets the stage for the way other people are talked about and how white people are set up against it. So I'm thinking like the one drop rule and some of the caucus talk and eugenics, and these are the foundational tenets of exclusion, right?
Yeah, definitely. So kind of the parallel track that I document in this same era, the 1890s through the 1920s, is an academic effort to define who counts as white, right? Because in terms of US society, there is white supremacy being enacted, right? The Jim Crow laws are in place. There's this effort to elevate the white population against the majority Black population at the time, but also these new immigrants who are arriving. And there's also the need to justify these new immigration laws that they're talking about. And since race is a social construct, there wasn't some sort of automatic basis for them to do this on. And so instead, these academics, predominantly at Ivy League schools, it's MIT, it's Harvard, where a lot of this is happening, Columbia as well, where there are scholars writing supposedly scientific reports about the superiority of white people, right? So, and they end up settling on the argument that it's not just white people who are superior, but it's actually this very narrow band with it that they come to call the Nordic peoples, right? Which are kind of Scandinavian, Northern European, English peoples are, as one author that I quote in the book calls them, the white man par excellence, right? And so, and then they create these kind of hierarchies then to justify the violence and exclusion inside the United States, but also to justify the exclusion of other people outside of it. And you're right that there are some really profound parallels with the ways that white supremacists today talk about things like the Great Replacement, right? The phrase the Great Replacement, that's something emerges in Europe in the early 2000s and kind of spreads into white supremacist thought in the last 20 years. But the underlying idea behind that, the idea that immigrants and non-white people will replace white people in particular countries, traces directly back to this Chinese exclusion era. And so in the book, I talk about There's a book called The Passing of the Great Race, written by a guy named Madison Grant. So he's one of the ones theorizing these hierarchies of different races. And he's someone who was also involved in the environmental movement and had spent time in the Western US working on protected areas for things like the American bison. And his insight is that to him, the white race in America is like an endangered species, right? And that the only way to protect it is to create like a protected area like they were doing for the bison. And the way to do that is immigration controls. And that if they didn't, it could be what Teddy Roosevelt at the time called um, uh, 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 sorry, I lost the phrase. Race suicide is what he calls it. There's so many of these different ways that they frame the same sort of idea, right? But Teddy Roosevelt says that allowing too much immigration would be the suicide of the white race because, in the way that they described it, immigrants have more babies than white people, and the number of white people is too small compared to these other groups that are arriving. And so the only way to prevent that is through these immigration restrictions.
Well, and I was struck by the admission. I forget who said it, but there's a quote about how basically we can't stop race mixing once they're here because white men won't stop having sex with with immigrant people, and that's part of that race suicide, right? And that's kind of an admission of something that is so virulently denied about slave owners and this system of slavery and how that was such a prevalent activity and that crime against the slaves as well. But anyway, I digress. I would love to talk about how the environmental movement factors into this because I think we're seeing something very similar today with the anti-vaccine movement and like natural homeopathy and all these kind of what would be considered liberal causes that somehow are infiltrated by this white supremacy and this kind of junk science of eugenics and race suicide and all this kind of stuff. So if you wouldn't mind walking us kind of through that, how that happened.
Yeah, that was another aspect while working on this book that I was surprised by. I didn't realize this strong connection between the environmental movement and kind of a racially defined immigration exclusion movement. But it comes up over and over again, right? I mean, in the kind of the first era of the eugenics organizing in the United States, so that's the 19 teens, the museum directors in New York were kind of key figures in that. People like Madison Grant, who I mentioned before, were influential in that effort. Kind of making this claim, right, that there's this science behind these eugenics theories, and then. And if we kind of skip forward to the present era, kind of the modern anti-immigrant movement also emerged out of the environmental movement, which is a kind of another story that I think we're going to get to, but maybe not quite yet. But figures like Paul Ehrlich, who wrote The Population Bomb, were very influential in the early anti-immigrant movement in the U.S. in the 1970s that eventually leads to a Donald Trump and a Stephen Miller. And a lot of that happens through the figure of John Tanton, who I talk about a lot in the last third of the book.
Yeah, and I think if maybe talk a little bit more about how the immigration factored into the early kind of conservation movement, because it shifted. You mentioned John Muir, and I know he's kind of held up as this hero of the national park system, but he had an interesting take on immigration, right?
Yeah, I think the thing to emphasize is that there are very few people writing, few white people, right, writing in the turn of the 20th century who didn't have kind of racist eugenics views, right? So if you look at the writing of a lot of the key figures from that period, this view that white people were superior to other people is just commonly held, right? And so you can find it in a lot of people's writing. So John Muir, for example, would write about how the Native Americans that he encountered were just didn't belong in these natural landscapes that he was imagining in the West, right? And so, um, similar to that protected area idea, right? National parks often remove Native Americans, indigenous peoples from those places in order to create the supposedly pristine nature in those locations. Whereas, of course, the reality was that the people living there were part of those ecosystems, right? They were natural, right? And by forcing people out of those places, it actually creates a really unnatural landscape, this kind of imaginary ideal of wilderness that never really existed in the form that we hold it up today.
And I think that's an important metaphor as we move into this movement from like preservation, conservation, environmentalism, and how it gets tied to population growth, and how then that, overpopulation returns to this idea of some group overbreeding. And isn't that a terrible way of saying reproduction? But it goes all the way back, and it again is like this resurgence of these words that you think are gone and then suddenly come back. So let's talk about Tanton and the 60s and 70s.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It can make one historical connection first. The, you know, there are kind of these demographic cycles that have happened over the last 200 years, right? And it just so happened that the Europeans were the kind of first group to go through this period of population growth, right? And that's the period of 1700s and 1800s where Europeans are migrating all over the world or colonizing all of these places, right? They are the place with the masses of people in slums in cities that have to get on boats and go to another location. By the 1940s and 50s, that sort of population growth in Europe had been slowed, right? And we have kind of the more contemporary demographic trends in those places. So, but at the moment now, we're kind of at the tail end of a period of population growth in other parts around the world, right? Which are tied to economic transitions, the state system. It's a whole wide reason why that's happening. And so the kind of the high horse position of many European people or people with European ancestry living around the world, that these other people shouldn't be migrating and they should stay where they are, is really just an outrageous position historically. Um, but okay, John Tanton. So John Tanton, he is this kind of crazy figure that was hugely influential in the United States, but he's someone that a lot of people haven't heard of. So, he's been called maybe the most influential American that no one has heard of. So what did he do? So in the late 1960s, he was really influenced by Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb, this idea that overpopulation was going to destroy the earth, right? Which didn't come to pass. But his take on it was specifically that really the US population had kind of stabilized by the 1970s. And so his really strong love of the environment in the United States, he realized wasn't simply threatened by population growth, but specifically it was threatened by population growth elsewhere. Right. And so his view on how to protect the American environment was that we need to use immigration controls to prevent all these other people from coming in and destroying this precious American environment that he so loved. And so in the early 1970s, he's an influential figure at the Sierra Club. The Sierra Club has a lot of history of kind of right on the edge of this anti-immigrant movement. He's becomes the president of Paul Ehrlich's Zero Population Growth. But by the late 1970s, he is wanting to be completely focused on immigration, but he can't quite convince these other organizations to do that. So in 1979, he founds his own group, the Federation for American Immigration Reform. And the mission there is to focus directly on immigration as the biggest threat to the United States in his view. And so he starts to lobby Congress around these efforts. it's a big story, this guy John Tanton, because from from the Federation of American Immigration Reform, he founds over a dozen other groups that focus on different aspects of the anti-immigration movement. The most important ones are the Center for Immigration Studies, which he founds in the 1980s, and Numbers USA, which he founds in the 1990s. And the result is he realizes that there's no one else doing these things. So he needs to make it seem like there's this kind of broad-based grassroots effort. And so you'll see in like the 1990s in the New York Times, they'll interview people about immigration. And the first person will be from the Federation for American Immigration Reform. The next one will be the Center of Immigration Studies. The next one will be Numbers USA. And they treat it as if it's three different organizations that all happen to be saying the same things about we need to stop immigration, when in reality, they're all founded by the same guy. And moreover, as I talk about in the book, they're also funded by the same lady. The vast majority of the funding for the anti-immigrant movement in the US comes from Cordelia Scaife May, who was an heir of the Mellon fortune, and was the richest woman in the United States in the 1990s, died in 2004, and left over $400 million to these anti-immigrant groups that John Tanton had set up. And so they've had this kind of profound impact on shaping American thought on immigration. But really, it's this kind of carried out by just a couple of people, right, that have done this kind of amazing reshaping of the way that the media talks about it, the way that the Republican Party talks about immigration in the United States.
Well, and troublingly so, there's this infiltration of, because it's ambiguous as to whether or not Tanton himself was a white supremacist, right? But he definitely didn't mind working with them or using them for his cause, correct? And his funder pretty much was. Is that what? Am I stating that correctly?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would go as far as to say that he was a white supremacist, right? I mean, the Southern Poverty Law Center listed him. He passed away in 2019. But they listed him as a anti-immigrant extremist, right? And they treated his groups as hate groups. So I think it's fair to say that he was. But what he was good at was kind of hiding that, right? So although so one mistake he made is he left a lot of his papers to a library in Michigan. And so researchers have been able to go through those papers and have found that throughout this period where he's kind of presenting this face forward as kind of a moderate suit, I'm, we need to restrict immigration, but it's a bipartisan idea. He's corresponding with white supremacists that entire period of time, right? And writing about how they share the same goals and same ideas, and they're working on this together. But he realizes he can't talk in that sort of way publicly, right? And so instead, he presents this kind of clean-cut public face while having all of these white supremacist ideas behind it. So I think the total picture we have of him is that he was directly connected to these white supremacists. And the results of his organization's work are to continue these white supremacist influenced laws about immigration in the United States. As I document in the book, a lot of the key figures in Trump's campaign were directly tied to these Tanton groups, right? So Jeff Sessions had been a close ally of the Tanton group since the early 2000s. Stephen Miller gave keynote speeches at these Tanton groups events just weeks before he joins the Trump campaign. And some of his emails were leaked while he was in the White House, Stephen Miller, and it showed that during the year where the campaign was happening, at least once a week, he emailed someone from a Tanton group to work on a story or to get data, right? So he is directly using these groups as a key source of information for his campaign. Someone like Kellyanne Conway was the pollster for these groups for many years, right? So a lot of the key figures in the Trump campaign have direct connections and really get their push through John Tanton.
And that's why when the criticism of Trump's immigration policy says he was specifically white supremacist, this is why. because there is this direct tie to Tanton, who then goes back to through into the eugenics movement and those kind of guys into, as your book says, the beginning of immigration as racial exclusion, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, someone like Jeff Sessions cited the 1924 immigration law, which I don't think we really talked about yet, but just an overtly racist law. The headline of the New York Times after it passed was "America of the melting pot comes to an end," right? And the racial type as it exists here today is made permanent. Jeff Sessions, in an interview, cited that as the model for what the United States should do. Stephen Miller regularly uses the coded words of this sort of movement. They definitely say explicitly that immigrants are replacing white Americans, right? So it's not just that they're extending these laws and they have these connections to Tanton. They're using the language that these people use as well. So it's fairly explicit that was their goal, and they did a lot of that, right? And towards the last sections of the book, I document the impacts that they had, right? And during the 4 years that Trump was in office, there were over 1,000 changes to immigration laws in the U.S. So of course, there were very obvious things like the Muslim ban, the child separation policies, and things like that. But behind the scenes, there were all these other changes which made it more difficult for people to migrate to the United States. Which fits with their goal of reducing, right, overall immigration to the country. And so I think that the scholars who've studied it have said that during that period, the result was over 1 million less legal immigrants to the country because of those changes that were put in place.
Well, could you speak a little bit about the border wall and the rise of the white supremacist, white power militia movement along that, and how Trump capitalized on that and really gave them, incorporated their rhetoric into the mainstream?
Yeah, absolutely. So the border has been a focus for white supremacist groups for many years, right? So, like even the Ku Klux Klan, like we often talk about the Ku Klux Klan as if it's primarily an anti-Black organization. And of course it is. But if you look at the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s, when kind of the second version of it emerges, immigration is a key plank of what they're talking about. And in the book, I talk about David Duke in the 1970s when he's trying to kind of restart his effort as a key Ku Klux Klan leader. Where does he go? He goes to the US-Mexico border, right? And he says he's starting a Klan border watch, right, to prevent people from immigrating into the United States, right? So although these sort of questions really enter the mainstream decades later, Ku Klux Klan, white supremacist leaders have been doing this for a while, right? It's been their key issue for many, many years, right? And so what Trump does is to take that sort of language and make it somehow palatable at a larger scale, right? So he, for whatever reason, and I'm not a Trump theorist, so I don't have an expert on why he's so good at what he does, but he seems to be able to take these things that have been fermenting below at this lower level and then just say them, and then somehow it's okay to say them, right? And so it's okay to have these very extreme views that just 5 or 10 years ago would have been completely unacceptable for any politician to say, and really any person in the United States to say, because that sort of racist language had been kind of frowned upon and put to the side. And he's brought that right back into the public sphere, right? I mean, he launched his campaign, right? His very first campaign event is about the Mexican rapists coming across the border, right? So he starts with a racist argument about immigration as the foundation of what he's running for president.
Right, and also even before he announces, he was out there saying that Obama was a secret immigrant and wasn't a naturalized American, wasn't, and that itself. I think people had a hard time understanding why that was racist, and it's because of all of this. Who can be American, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean with the birther stuff, he kind of, it was a dry run of whether this is effective and how he can talk about it and the extent that he can talk about it. So, yeah, absolutely. Birthright citizenship, which is something that emerges after the Civil War, is something that continues to be questioned by the kind of extreme right in the United States and is seen as something that is a threat to that notion of white supremacy. Because as the current rule is, even if someone comes in without the proper documents, if their child is born here, that child is a citizen, right? And that if you're looking at this from that kind of white supremacist lens, that is an extreme threat to their version of what the United States should be.
So where are we now, and how has this made permanent changes to our immigration, and what can we as a nation do to rectify some of not only the way we talk about it, but the way we enact our immigration reform? Because all points are saying that there's going to be this massive, over the next several decades of climate-induced movement. And how can we as a nation prepare for it that isn't buying into this racist and horrible legacy?
Yeah. I think I would take a step back and just say that movement is a fundamental characteristic of humanity, right? If you look at the history of the human species, the thing we do is migrate, right? We move a lot around, we go to different places, right? So the really unnatural thing that we're doing right now is this imagined, I would say, idea that everyone belongs in a particular place and that it's acceptable for some humans to restrict the movement of other humans. So I would ask your listeners to think a little bit broadly about that and to question that assumption. It's ahistorical. It doesn't match with the history of humanity. And if we look at it in the United States case, it's rooted in racial exclusion. When did the first immigration laws get passed? They get passed when non-white people start to arrive. So the fundamental character of immigration restrictions is a racial exclusion, an exclusion of other people to prevent their access to the United States based on white supremacist ideas. Um, Scholars have for many years demonstrated that immigration is a benefit to the places that restrict it, right? I mean, there is no economic argument in favor of restrictions. The real argument is a racial argument. And so if we don't accept that, if you want to take an anti-racist position, then you should be against immigration restrictions, full stop, right? So what should it look like going forward? Well, I mean, the United States is a very large country. There is plenty of space in this country. The US should really be looking to open up immigration and to accept the fact that people are going to be moving. And instead of spending billions of dollars on violence, billions of dollars on walls, on guards, on restrictions, on efforts to prevent people from coming, instead move that money towards accepting them, right? Finding a way to bring them into society, provide them with whatever training they need, give them that assistance they need when they arrive so that then they can become thriving members of the society. They're coming either way, right? This migration is going to happen. And so the question is, what is our response to it? Is it a violent one or is it a welcoming one?
Well, thank you for your time, and thank you for the work that you do in this area. And if there's anywhere we could find, if people wanted to read more about you, what other books have you put out, and where can they contact you if they need to?
Yeah. Yeah, so I've written 4 books. So we were talking about White Borders today, which came out in 2021. My more recent book is Nobody is Protected, which looks specifically at the Border Patrol and their racist origins and the impact they're having inside the United States. So, but all of my books are widely available. You can find them on Amazon. I'm also pretty easy to find online. I'm happy to hear from listeners and guests.